If there's one thing that I've learned from my feeble attempts to start to read again as an adult, it's that I'm definitely not alone. I'm pretty sure it's a cliche at this point that those of us who were gifted, like, insatiable readers as children just end up completely quitting reading in like middle school. I mean, there's a million reasons why we could fall out of love with like the act of reading while still longing for that feeling that reading used to give us. And like, believe me, like the cognitive dissonance of describing myself as a reader my whole life, a reader, despite having read about like 5 books throughout all of high school and college for pleasure, insane. The resurgence of reading as like sort of trend, I guess. I hate it when people say that, but in a way it's true. It's kind of filled me with a strange sense of guilt as I like felt and still feel like some sort of outsider looking in. I mean, I would watch so many videos about books, about reading, about people who actually read. I even made a Goodreads account, Storygraph, but none of it actually translated to me, picking up a book and reading it. I genuinely couldn't figure out why I wasn't interested in reading anymore. And it becomes even more difficult the longer you haven't done that thing because, if you're anything like me, you've burrowed so deep into your own head about it that it just becomes this massive like monster that you have to conquer in order to do it when it's really just picking up a book and reading it. As opposed to the first time around when you started reading, when all of us probably didn't have all our teeth, you just picked up a book, liked it, and kept going. One of the most important things to keep in mind when you begin to read again is picking something that you will actually enjoy reading. This is definitely not the time to be judging yourself and worrying about what you should be reading. One of the times I set out to read again, I decided that I was going to read Wuthering Heights. I'm no hater of the classics, but I don't think that anyone would say that classics are easy to read. If it is for you, that's awesome. They are not for me. And that book has been collecting electronic dust in my Goodreads currently reading tab for about 3 years. So, and if you're not totally sure about what you even enjoy reading anymore, I completely understand that too. I think not understanding what my reading needs were as I got older was like the final nail in the coffin of my interest in reading, even more so than like all of the circumstantial stuff that comes with growing up. But for me, this might be slightly embarrassing. Usually the only book that I would be able to get through like during my reading slump, like my 1 book a year that I was able to complete, would be something adjacent to romance. I mean, I've always enjoyed reading a lot of different genres, blah blah blah, but I knew romance could pull me in the quickest, even if the book itself wasn't necessarily the perfect fit for me, and I could just worry about the rest later. And the one book that I remember doing that for me in the last like few years of my reading slump was Beach Read by Emily Henry. It actually ended up having a lot more depth than I was expecting it to have. The dialogue was very witty, the characters were likable. Wow! I mean, as if that's not what you want from every book. But like I said, I wasn't even being picky. So when I started to read again, I actually picked up 2 more books by her, People We Meet on Vacation and Book Lovers, both of which I loved, and finished in a couple days. Now, mind you, like I said, previous to those 2 books, I finished about 1 book a year. After this, I decided to go through and read every book on my shelf that had been sitting there for years. This turned out to be a very bad idea. As probably anyone could imagine, there were actual tangible reasons why they sat there for that long. I was halfway through a like vaguely condescending, mildly rude self-help book and a very dry, like adult character study of a novel, and I was just like, I don't want to be reading these books. It's like I had this epiphany that I have no responsibility to finish a book just because I started it, or even because it happened to be on my shelf physically. If you pick up a book and you aren't super interested in it, who cares? I'm not saying you should like toss it in the fire or anything, but we have so little time to read in this life. You really don't have to be reading things that you don't want to read. In a kind of a similar vein to that, you don't have to finish a book before you pick up another one. I've always been the kind of person who I pick up a book, I read it, to the end, and then I started another one. I think the idea of reading multiple books at once felt like watching multiple channels of TV at once. It was like something that I didn't think you were supposed to do. But honestly, it can be a really good idea, especially when you're reading something that you're interested in, but you're not in the mood for. Sometimes we're just in the mood for a different kind of story or a different genre altogether. So I think when I wasn't too into the book that I was reading at the time, I would kind of just assume that it was that I didn't want to read. And then I would pick up my phone and doom scroll for hours at a time, and then I really didn't want to read. I would not advise doing that. Having a library card helps a lot with this because you can check out a bunch of books at once and then just decide which of them you want to read, and there's no cost involved, there's no pressure. You can not read something and return it and then get it again a couple weeks later. Plus, it's always a good idea to support your local libraries. So at this point, I have my library card, I have a couple books, but I wasn't really finding it super easy to start reading again. I wasn't necessarily uninterested in what I was reading, but I think I had this misconception that I had to dedicate a large chunk of time to reading to be able to sit down and read. I realized that my ability to finish those 2 Emily Henry books so fast probably had something to do with the fact that I was stuck on an airplane with no Wi-Fi when I read them. Just being at home, going about my normal routine wasn't very conducive to reading, probably because my routine at home in my free time is doom scrolling on my phone while watching an endless stream of YouTube videos, and just like detaching from reality completely. I really want to emphasize that if you struggle with this too, please don't be too hard on yourself. I know a lot of people of a certain age like to place all of the blame on younger generations when it comes to technology, but this is all that we know. These phones were placed in our hands at a very young age, and I notice with a lot of the people that I know that we all have to go on some sort of journey to figure out how much technology we want in our lives, and it's a very intentional process to not spend all of your time on the internet. I mean, our devices and all of the apps on them are literally engineered by teams of people to engage our attention for as long as possible. I mean, that's how best to make money. So it's really not that surprising that most of us, whenever we have a moment of free time, we kind of feel the urge to reach for them. Finding time to read for me was essentially reprogramming my brain to reach for a book instead of my phone. And I mean, this is very difficult because a book is always going to offer less stimulation than short form, especially video content online. And, like I said before, I have a special little brain, so it's 10 times harder for me even. So for me, this meant kind of always having a book near me whenever I was in those points of time where I could sit down and read. Instead of watching things while I was eating, I would force myself to sit out at my kitchen table and read a book. I even forced myself to read on work breaks, on my commute, before bed. Even if I was bored with something that I was doing, I made this conscious effort to try and reach for a book instead of my phone. You don't have to read a bunch of pages in one sitting. There's no set amount of time for sitting down and reading. I mean, you don't even have to read every day. I think when building habits, you really have to be very lenient with yourself, because the worst thing ever is trying to do something and putting so much pressure on yourself to do all of it at once that you don't do it at all. I mean, your life is on your own timeline. You can take as long as you want to get back into reading, and if you want to get back into reading, you have to be okay with maybe taking smaller steps if you don't immediately snap back into it. For me, I really enjoy reading a little bit before bed because I feel like it's that lower level of stimulation so that I can actually fall asleep instead of saying that I'm going to watch a few TikToks and then end up scrolling for 4 hours. Some people find reading before bed too stimulating, they can't fall asleep after it, and that's fine. This is all about what makes you happy and what will get you back into the love of reading. And I mean, that is completely dependent on how your brain works personally. Something I think is really important with stuff like booktube and book talk nowadays is to try not to feel like you have to own every book that you read. I know I mentioned like supporting your local libraries earlier, but I really want to emphasize it because books are expensive. I don't think I'm the only person who, like, thinking about it, if I have to spend $20 on every book that I read, I'm not going to read very much. And the reason I mention like book talk and booktube specifically is because these massive bookshelves of these fancy collections of very like flashy, beautiful, like special edition books, they show very well online. I mean, a book might go viral just because it has really good cover art or like fancy sprayed edges or something like that. You know, so creators who have a platform that is based on books, I mean, it is an advantage for them to have these physical books with them just because it makes for better content. Personally, I only ever really buy books after I read them, because obviously if I read a book for one time and I'm like, okay, that's good, why would I buy it? I'm never gonna pick it up again. And even though I just made that point about not buying special editions of books just because they're pretty, I did buy the Six of Crows duology, the fancy sprayed edge version, but you can blame my library for that because that's the version they had, and honestly, if I hadn't known it would existed, I wouldn't have gotten it, but now I have them. They do look really nice on my rainbow bookshelf. I've kind of talked about this last point throughout the video, but I really want to end on emphasizing enjoying the process. I think reading as a hobby can get a very bad rap sometimes because people can be very pretentious and very competitive about it, which can be alienating when you just want to like have a good time, read 20 books a year, maybe read books that are considered guilty pleasure reads. But then when you see people online reading like 300 books in a year in these insane challenge videos or talking about how easy it is to read the classics and how everyone who wants to call themselves a reader has to read them, and suddenly you feel like you're not doing enough. That's simply just not true. I mean, if reading 300 books a year makes you happy, that's awesome. And if you're able to do that, I envy you. I think that's literally a full-time job. There's really no criteria for being a reader. I mean, some people will probably say I'm not a real gamer because I, right now, only really play Stardew Valley and like Minecraft. But guess what? Those are still video games. If you think it's fun to make fun of people for the things that they enjoy, you know, just know that I would throw tomatoes at you in the town square. Anyways, the whole point of this video was to kind of celebrate me finally starting to read again and like outlining my thought process and seeing what actually helped me in hopes that it might help someone else. A lot of videos I've seen on the subject are from people who already read a lot or have at least been reading a lot for a fair amount of time because they usually have a channel dedicated to it. But, you know, if you're someone who is trying to yank yourself out of a 6-year-long reading slump like me, here you go. If you enjoyed this video, you can like and subscribe if you want to see more from me. If you want, no pressure. I understand if you don't. It's whatever. I don't even care. But yeah, if you would like to stick around, I will see you in a future video. I think that's all I have for today. Bye!